Billionaire celebrated his success until his ex-employee walked in holding a baby in front of all. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from, and once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. The rooftop of the Beverly Hills Meridian Tower glittered like a constellation brought down to earth. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the crowd of tech moguls, venture capitalists, and social media influencers who had gathered to celebrate a decade of Mindzen's unprecedented success. The Los Angeles skyline stretched endlessly beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, but tonight, all eyes were focused on one man. Callum Devereux stood at the edge of the main stage, adjusting his midnight blue Tom Ford suit. At 37, he possessed the kind of effortless magnetism that made magazine covers and board meetings equally captivating. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, and his steel gray eyes held the confident gleam of someone who had never known failure. Standing 6'2" with an athletic build maintained by early morning sessions with his personal trainer, Callum commanded attention without trying. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator whispered into her headset, "we're going live in 30 seconds. Callum nodded, his fingers briefly touching the platinum watch on his wrist, a gift to himself when Mindzen hit its first billion in valuation. The app had revolutionized productivity for millions of users worldwide, combining meditation techniques with focus-enhancing technology. Tonight's celebration was being live-streamed to over 200,000 viewers, with a Ragger Mindzen decade trending across all social platforms. The coordinator gave him the signal. Callum stepped forward, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the marble floor as he approached the podium. The crowd fell silent, phones raised to capture every moment. 10 years ago, Callum began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of countless TED Talks and investor presentations. "I had a simple belief that technology could help us find clarity in chaos, focus in distraction, purpose in—" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Callum paused, his trained speaker's instincts telling him something was wrong. He followed the collective gaze of his audience toward the elevator bank, where the stainless steel doors had just opened. Time seemed to slow as Carolina Rourke stepped into the main hall. She was 29, with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Her skin was pale and tired, but her green eyes held a determination that cut through the room's ambient chatter like a blade. She wore a simple black dress, not designer, but clean and dignified, and comfortable flats that made no sound as she walked. But it wasn't Carolina herself that caused the room to fall into stunned silence. It was the 2-month-old baby she carried in her arms. Callum's champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering against the stage floor in a sound that seemed to echo forever. His practiced smile vanished, replaced by an expression of pure shock that no amount of media training could have prepared him for. Carolina walked with quiet purpose through the crowd that parted before her like the Red Sea. She didn't look left or right, didn't acknowledge the phones now frantically recording her every step. Her focus was entirely on Callum, standing frozen at the podium, his face pale under the stage lights. The baby in her arms was tiny, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos erupting around them. His features were delicate but unmistakably familiar, the same strong jawline, the same dark hair that would one day match his father's. "Oh my God," someone whispered near the back of the crowd. "Is that—" "Quiet," another voice hissed. "They're still streaming." But Carolina had already reached the front of the room. She stood there, perhaps 15 feet from the stage, looking up at the man who had once held her heart and then crushed it without a second thought. The baby stirred slightly in her arms, making a soft sound that carried in the sudden silence. For a moment, the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the streets below, and the subtle whir of the cameras still recording everything. Callum gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. This was a man who had given presentations to Fortune 500 CEOs, who had been interviewed on every major network, who had built an empire on the foundation of mental clarity and focus. But right now, looking at Carolina and the child in her arms, Callum Devereux was completely, utterly lost. Would you have had the courage to walk into that room, knowing the whole world was watching? The Mindzen headquarters in Santa Monica buzzed with its usual controlled chaos of innovation. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Pacific Ocean, while employees moved between open workspaces filled with standing desks, meditation pods, and walls covered in inspirational quotes about mindfulness and productivity. Carolina Rourke sat at her desk in the user experience department, her fingers dancing across dual monitors as she refined the interface for MindZen's upcoming meditation feature. At 28, she possessed a rare combination of technical brilliance and emotional intelligence that made her invaluable to the team. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and she unconsciously tucked a strand behind her ear as she concentrated on her work. "Burning the midnight oil again, Rourke?" The familiar voice made her heart skip. She looked up to find Callum standing beside her desk, having approached with the quiet confidence that seemed to be his trademark. Up close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that reminded her of ocean breezes and cedar. "Just perfecting the user flow for the new guided meditation series," she replied, trying to keep her voice professional despite the way her pulse quickened whenever he was near. "I think we can reduce the onboarding process by 30% without losing emotional impact." Callum leaned over her shoulder to examine the screen, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His proximity sent a familiar flutter through her stomach, a reaction she'd been fighting for months. "Brilliant," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You always see what the rest of us miss." Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully over the past 8 months. It had started with late-night project discussions in his office, conversations that gradually shifted from business to personal. Callum had shared stories about his childhood in Connecticut, how his father's early death had driven him to succeed at any cost. Carolina had opened up about her small-town Ohio upbringing, her mother's struggle with depression, and her dream of creating technology that actually helped people heal. "Carolina," his voice was softer now, almost hesitant. "Are you free tonight? I was thinking we could discuss the meditation project over dinner, somewhere quiet." She looked around the office, noting how several colleagues had glanced their way. Workplace relationships were technically allowed at MindZen, but she knew the scrutiny that came with dating the CEO. Still, the thought of spending another evening with Callum, talking for hours over wine and candlelight, was too tempting to resist. "I'd like that," she said quietly. That evening, they met at a small Italian restaurant in Venice Beach, far from the tech crowd that usually surrounded them. Callum had chosen a corner table where they could speak freely, away from potential eavesdroppers or photographers. He'd changed from his usual business attire into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater that made his gray eyes seem even more intense. "I have a confession," Carolina said over her second glass of Chianti, the wine making her bold. "When I first started at MindZen, I thought you were just another Silicon Valley ego in an expensive suit." Callum laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his entire face. "And now? Now I know you're an ego in an expensive suit who also happens to be brilliant, surprisingly funny, and—" She paused, suddenly aware of how much she was revealing. "And someone I care about more than I probably should." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Callum reached across the table, his fingers finding hers. His touch was warm, slightly rough from his weekend rock climbing sessions. "Carolina," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you terrify me." "Why?" "Because for the first time in my life I'm not thinking about the next quarter's projections or the next product launch. I'm thinking about what it would be like to wake up next to you every morning." She felt her breath catch. They'd been dancing around this moment for weeks, both of them knowing they were falling into something deeper than casual attraction. "Then why do you look like you're about to run away?" she asked softly. Callum's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because I don't know how to do this, Carolina. I've spent my entire adult life building walls, creating distance. MindZen succeeded because I never let emotions cloud my judgment." "I'm not asking you to compromise your business," she said, squeezing his hand. "I'm asking you to trust that maybe, just maybe, letting someone in won't destroy everything you've built." That night, he drove her back to her apartment in Manhattan Beach, a cozy one-bedroom place she'd decorated with plants, vintage books, and photographs from her travels. For a moment, they sat in his Tesla in comfortable silence, listening to the distant sound of waves. "Come up," she whispered, surprising herself with her boldness. Callum turned to look at her, his gray eyes searching her face in the dashboard light. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering, she leaned over and kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, but when he responded, pulling her closer, it deepened into something that felt like coming home and falling off a cliff at the same time. That night, in her bedroom with its white cotton sheets and the sound of the ocean through open windows, They crossed every line they'd drawn between professional and personal. Callum was tender and passionate, whispering her name like a prayer as they moved together in the moonlight. But even as Carolina fell asleep in his arms, she couldn't shake the feeling that this perfect moment was too fragile to last. 3 weeks later, Carolina's world had shifted into something that felt simultaneously dreamlike and terrifyingly real. Her days at Mind's End had taken on a different rhythm: stolen glances across conference rooms, text messages that made her smile during the most mundane meetings, and the intoxicating anticipation of knowing that when the office emptied, she and Callum would find reasons to stay behind. She was reviewing user feedback reports when her phone buzzed with a message from him. "My office, 7 p.m. I have something to show you." By 7, the 42nd floor was nearly empty, save for the soft hum of computers and the distant sound of traffic from Santa Monica Boulevard below. Carolina made her way to Callum's corner office, her heels clicking softly against the polished concrete floors. She found him standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, silhouetted against the golden Los Angeles sunset. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, revealing strong forearms that still made her pulse quicken. On his desk, she noticed a bottle of champagne chilling in an ice bucket alongside 2 crystal flutes. "What's the occasion?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Callum turned, and the smile that spread across his face was unlike any she'd seen before, unguarded, almost boyish. "We just closed the Series D funding round, $1,200 million. "Callum, that's incredible." Carolina rushed to him, throwing her arms around his neck as he lifted her off the ground, spinning her in a circle. When he set her down, his hands remained on her waist, thumbs tracing small circles through the fabric of her emerald green dress. "I wanted you to be the first to know," he said quietly. "You're the reason I can think clearly enough to make decisions like this." He poured the champagne, Dom Perignon, she noticed, and handed her a glass. The bubbles tickled her nose as she took a sip, the expensive alcohol warming her chest. "To clarity," Callum said, raising his glass. "To taking chances," she countered, meeting his eyes. They drank, and then he was kissing her, pressing her back against the cool glass of the window. The city sprawled below them, millions of lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. But Carolina was only aware of Callum's hands in her hair, the taste of champagne on his lips, the way he whispered her name, like it was the most important word he'd ever spoken. Later, as they lay together on the leather couch in his office, Carolina traced patterns on his bare chest with her fingertip. His skin was warm and smooth, marked only by a small scar near his collarbone from a childhood accident he'd told her about. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," she said softly. Callum was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I wake up at 3 in the morning and I can't breathe, not because of anxiety or stress, but because I realize how empty my life was before you." Carolina lifted her head to look at him. In the dim light from the city below, his face looked younger, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "You're not empty, Callum. You're just scared of being full." He cupped her face with his palm, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "What if I mess this up? What if I hurt you? What if you don't?" she replied, leaning into his touch. But even as she said the words, Carolina noticed something in his expression, a flicker of doubt that he tried to hide behind another kiss. She pushed the observation away, choosing instead to lose herself in the feeling of being wanted by someone she was rapidly falling in love with. The next morning, Carolina arrived at work early, still glowing from the previous evening. She'd gone home around midnight, but not before Callum had made her promise to be careful about how they appeared at the office. "Just until we figure out how to handle this publicly," he'd said, and she'd agreed, understanding the complexity of their situation. She was organizing her desk when Meredith Chen from HR approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Carolina, could I have a word with you in my office?" Something cold settled in Carolina's stomach as she followed Meredith down the hallway. The HR office was all clean lines and motivational posters about workplace wellness. Ironic, given what was about to happen. "Please sit down," Meredith said, closing the door. She was a petite woman in her 40s with perfectly styled black hair and the kind of professional demeanor that revealed nothing. "Is everything okay?" Carolina asked, though she was beginning to suspect it wasn't. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. We're going through a restructuring in the UX department, and unfortunately your position is being eliminated." The words hit Carolina like a physical blow. "I'm sorry, what?" "I know this is sudden, but the decision came from the executive level. Your work has been exemplary, of course. which is why we're offering a generous severance package. Meredith slid a folder across the desk. 6 months' salary, extended health benefits, and excellent references for your job search. Carolina stared at the folder without touching it. From the executive level, I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics of the decision-making process. Can I speak to Callum about this? Meredith's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Mr. Devereaux is in back-to-back meetings all day. I'm afraid this decision is final. Carolina felt the room spinning slightly. Less than 12 hours ago, she'd been in Callum's arms, listening to him confess his fears about their relationship. Now she was being fired? I'll need you to clear out your desk this morning, Meredith continued gently. Security will escort you out as a standard procedure, nothing personal. Walking back to her desk felt surreal. Carolina packed her few personal items, a succulent plant, some photographs, her favorite coffee mug, while trying to make sense of what was happening. Several colleagues approached to express their shock and confusion, but their sympathy only made everything worse. She kept glancing toward Callum's office, hoping to catch a glimpse of him, to see some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But his door remained closed, and Meredith was right. According to his assistant, he was unavailable all day. As security walked her to the elevator, Carolina's phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, her heart leaped, thinking it might be Callum with an explanation. Instead, it was from her dentist's office confirming her appointment for the following week. Standing in the lobby of the building where she'd worked for 2 years, clutching a cardboard box of her belongings, Carolina felt more lost than she had since her mother's death 3 years earlier. That evening, she sat in her apartment, staring at her phone, and waiting for Callum to call. He had to call. There had to be an explanation. The man who had whispered about waking up at 3 in the morning, who had held her like she was precious, that man wouldn't just discard her without a word. But as the hours passed and her phone remained silent, a terrible understanding began to settle over her like a cold fog. By 9 p.m., Carolina couldn't wait any longer. She drove back to the Mind's End building, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the steering wheel of her Honda Civic. The contrast between her modest car and Callum's Tesla suddenly felt symbolic of everything wrong between them. The parking garage was nearly empty, save for a few vehicles belonging to the cleaning crew and night security. Carolina used her keycard, which somehow still worked, to access the building one last time. She had to know. She had to hear from Callum himself that this wasn't some terrible mistake. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt eternal. When the doors opened, she saw light spilling from Callum's office at the end of the hallway. Her heart lifted slightly. He was here. They could talk and he would explain everything. As she approached his office, she could hear his voice through the partially open door. He was on the phone, pacing behind his desk as he often did during important calls. I know it seems harsh, but it had to be done, Callum was saying, his tone businesslike and cold, nothing like the warm, intimate voice that had whispered her name just hours earlier. Carolina froze in the hallway, something instinctive telling her to listen before announcing her presence. Look, Daniel, Callum continued, and she recognized the name of his business partner and co-founder. You were right about the risks. Getting involved with an employee was a mistake from the beginning. The words hit Carolina like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stay silent, to keep listening. It was just a passatempo, a distraction. I let it go on too long, but I've handled it now. Clean break, generous severance, no legal complications. Carolina's breath caught in her throat. Passatempo, the Portuguese word he'd learned from her when she'd told him about her Brazilian grandmother. The word that meant pastime, hobby, something temporary to occupy your time. Carolina was becoming too attached, Callum said, his voice carrying a note of dismissal that made her stomach turn. I could see it in her eyes, the way she looked at me. Women like that, they start imagining futures that were never on the table. Better to cut it off before it became a real problem. There was a pause as Daniel spoke on the other end. No, she won't be an issue, Callum replied. She's too proud to make a scene, and besides, what could she say? We never made any promises to each other. It was just convenient while it lasted. Carolina pressed her back against the wall, feeling like she might collapse. This was the same man who had told her she terrified him because he was falling in love. The same man who had made love to her with such tenderness that she'd felt cherished, protected. Trust me, Daniel. I needed to get my head clear for the Series D, and she was becoming a distraction I couldn't afford. Now I can focus on what really matters. Growing the company, the IPO discussions, the merger possibilities. Another pause. Exactly. I've learned my lesson about mixing business with pleasure. From now on, it's strictly professional relationships. No more complications. Carolina heard the sound of Callum sitting down in his leather chair, the same chair where they'd held each other just the night before. Besides, he added, and she could picture him leaning back with that confident smile she'd fallen in love with. There are plenty of other options out there. That venture capitalist from Goldman Sachs has been very friendly at the last few events. Much more appropriate for someone in my position. The casual cruelty of his words was like acid in her veins. Carolina found herself backing toward the elevator, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. Not here. Not where he might see her and know that she'd heard every devastating word. She made it to her car before the first sob escaped. Sitting in the parking garage beneath the building where she'd thought she'd found love, Carolina finally understood the truth. She hadn't been his girlfriend, his partner, his future. She'd been his passatempo, his distraction, his mistake. The drive home was a blur of tears and traffic lights. When she finally reached her apartment, Carolina went straight to the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked pale and hollow-eyed, like someone recovering from a severe illness. That's when the nausea hit. She barely made it to the toilet before her dinner came up, along with the champagne they'd shared in celebration of his success. Success that apparently meant more to him than she ever had. As she knelt on the cold bathroom tiles, Carolina tried to convince herself it was just the emotional shock, just her body's reaction to having her heart shattered. But even as she thought it, another possibility whispered in the back of her mind, a possibility that made everything infinitely more complicated. She'd been feeling tired lately, emotional in ways that seemed out of proportion. Her period was... When was her last period? With shaking hands, Carolina grabbed her phone and opened her calendar app, counting backward. Her blood ran cold. 6 days late. She thought about the nights she and Callum had spent together, the passion that had sometimes overridden caution. They'd been careful most of the time, but there had been moments. Carolina closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against the cool tile of her bathroom wall. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when she'd just learned that the man she'd fallen in love with considered her nothing more than a temporary distraction. But even as she tried to deny it, her body was already telling her the truth. The nausea, the exhaustion, the way certain smells had been bothering her lately. Smells she usually enjoyed, like her morning coffee. Tomorrow she would buy a test. Tomorrow she would know for sure. But tonight, alone in her apartment with the sound of distant traffic and her neighbor's television through thin walls, Carolina Rourke allowed herself to grieve for the future she'd imagined with a man who had never seen her as anything more than a pleasant way to pass the time. Outside her window, the lights of Los Angeles twinkled like fallen stars, beautiful and unreachable, just like everything she'd thought she'd found with Callum Devereux. The CVS on Wilshire Boulevard felt like the longest walk of Carolina's life. She'd driven there at 7 a.m. knowing the store would be nearly empty, just her, the cashier, and the fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and clinical. She stood in the family planning aisle for 10 minutes, staring at the wall of pregnancy tests like they might reveal their secrets without her having to buy one. First Response Clear Blue EPT, brands she'd never paid attention to before, each promising accuracy and early detection. The cashier was a teenager with purple hair and tired eyes who didn't look twice at Carolina's purchase. She bought the test, a bottle of water and a pack of gum she didn't want just to make the transaction feel less monumental. Back in her apartment, Carolina sat on her bathroom floor with the test in her hands, reading the instructions for the third time. 3 minutes. That's all it would take to know if her life was about to change forever. She thought about calling her sister Jennifer in Ohio, but what would she say? Hey Jen, remember that boss I was maybe falling in love with? Well, he fired me after calling me a distraction, and now I might be carrying his baby. The timer on her phone seemed to tick with unusual loudness. Carolina closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing the way Callum's own app had taught her. The irony wasn't lost on her, using Mind's End's meditation techniques to cope with the aftermath of its creator's betrayal. When the timer chimed, Carolina opened her eyes and looked down. 2 pink lines, clear and unmistakable. She stared at the test for a long moment, waiting for some surge of emotion. Panic, joy, terror, anything. Instead, she felt strangely numb, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. Pregnant. She was pregnant with Callum Devereux's child. The man who had called her a passatempo was going to be a father, and he didn't even know it. Carolina's first instinct was to call him immediately. to drive to his office and demand that he face this reality. But then she remembered his voice on the phone, cold and dismissive, talking about her like she was a problem he'd successfully solved. Instead, she found herself dialing her doctor's office. Dr. Martinez's office, this is Rosa speaking. Hi, this is Carolina Rourke. I need to schedule an appointment as soon as possible. I think I'm pregnant. The appointment was set for the following afternoon. Carolina spent the rest of the day in a strange state of suspended animation, alternating between moments of clarity and periods where the whole situation felt surreal. She called in sick to the temp agency she'd signed with after leaving Mindzen, then spent hours researching everything she could about early pregnancy. Prenatal vitamins, diet changes, what to expect in the first trimester. The practical side of her mind kicked in, creating lists and researching healthcare costs while the emotional side remained carefully locked away. At Dr. Martinez's office the next day, Carolina sat on the examination table in a paper gown, her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Elena Martinez was a warm woman in her 50s who had been Carolina's gynecologist for 3 years. So, congratulations are in order? Doctor, Martinez asked gently as she reviewed Carolina's chart. I'm not sure yet, Carolina replied honestly. The blood test confirmed what the home test had already told her. She was approximately 6 weeks pregnant, which meant the baby had been conceived during one of those tender nights when she'd believed Callum was falling in love with her. Everything looks good so far, Dr. Martinez said, pulling up a chair beside the examination table. Your levels are normal, and based on your last menstrual period, we're looking at a due date in early May. Carolina tried to imagine herself 7 months from now, holding a baby that would have Callum's gray eyes and her stubborn chin. I need to ask, Dr. Martinez continued carefully, about your support system. The father? Is he involved? Carolina's laugh was bitter. He doesn't know, and I'm not sure he ever will. That's a significant decision. Have you thought about what you want to do? Carolina had been thinking about little else. She was 28, financially unstable after losing her job and facing single motherhood. The logical choice seemed clear, but every time she tried to imagine walking into a clinic, something inside her rebelled. I want to keep the baby, she heard herself say, surprising them both. I don't know how I'm going to manage it, but I want to keep the baby. Dr. Martinez smiled. Then we'll make sure you have everything you need. I'm going to prescribe prenatal vitamins and folic acid. We'll also need to discuss your anxiety medication. Carolina's stomach dropped. She'd been taking sertraline for anxiety since college, a low dose that helped keep her panic attacks manageable. We'll need to evaluate whether it's safe to continue during pregnancy, Dr. Martinez explained. Many women do continue with certain SSRIs, but we'll want to monitor you closely. Another complication in an already complicated situation. Carolina nodded, adding it to the growing list of things she'd have to figure out on her own. That evening, she sat in her small kitchen with a glass of water and the bottle of prenatal vitamins, staring at the horse-sized pills she was supposed to take daily for the next 7 months. On her laptop screen was a job search website, dozens of positions she could apply for now that she was unemployed. But there was also another tab open, Callum's LinkedIn profile. His latest post was a professional headshot with the caption, "Grateful for the incredible team that made our Series D possible. Onward and upward. Mindzen. Growth. Leadership." Hundreds of comments congratulated him, praised his vision, called him an inspiration. Carolina wondered what they would think if they knew that this visionary leader had discarded a pregnant employee like yesterday's coffee. She closed the laptop and placed her hand on her still flat stomach. It was impossible to believe there was a life growing inside her, a tiny cluster of cells that would somehow become a person with Callum's intelligence and her determination. It's just you and me, little one, she whispered to her reflection in the dark window. But I promise you something. You're not going to grow up thinking you were unwanted. Because whatever your father thinks of me, you were conceived in what I thought was love. Outside, Los Angeles continued its relentless pace, millions of people pursuing their dreams under the endless sky. But in her small apartment, Carolina Rourke began the quiet, determined work of rebuilding her life around the most important person she'd never met. The morning sickness started in week 8 and lasted until week 16, leaving Carolina pale and exhausted as she struggled through phone interviews for freelance graphic design work. She'd converted her small dining nook into a makeshift office, complete with a second-hand desk from Craigslist and a computer setup that would have to suffice until she could afford better equipment. So, Ms. Rourke, The voice on the phone belonged to Gerald Hoffman, creative director at a small marketing firm in Culver City. Your portfolio is impressive, but there's a gap in your employment history. You left Mind's End 3 months ago? Carolina gripped the phone tighter, fighting a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with pregnancy hormones. I decided to pursue freelance opportunities to have more creative freedom. It was the lie she'd perfected over dozens of similar conversations. She couldn't tell potential employers that she'd been fired after a personal relationship with the CEO went wrong. In the tech world, reputation was everything, and Callum's influence reached far beyond Mind's End's offices. I see. Well, we're looking for someone to start immediately on a campaign for a wellness app. Ironic, given your background. Gerald's chuckle made Carolina's stomach churn. But we can only offer $25 per hour, and it's project-based. $25 an hour was a third of what she'd been making at Mind's End. But Carolina had already learned that pregnancy made job hunting nearly impossible. Even when employers couldn't ask directly, they found ways to eliminate pregnant candidates from consideration. That works for me, she said, adding another small compromise to the growing list. By month 4, Carolina had established a routine that revolved around managing her anxiety without her usual medication, attending prenatal appointments alone, and working enough freelance hours to cover rent and groceries. Barely. Dr. Martinez had helped her transition to a pregnancy-safe anti-anxiety medication, but the adjustment period had been rough, filled with sleepless nights and days when leaving her apartment felt impossible. She joined an online support group for single mothers, finding comfort in the stories of women who were navigating similar challenges. There was Marie in Seattle, whose partner had left when she refused to terminate the pregnancy. Lisa in Austin, whose husband had died in a car accident at 6 months pregnant, and dozens of others who reminded Carolina that she wasn't alone, even when she felt completely isolated. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or the financial stress. It was the loneliness. Carolina found herself talking to the baby constantly, narrating her days as if her unborn child could understand. "Your kicks are getting stronger," she said one evening in month 6, her hand resting on her rounded belly as she sat in her small living room. "Dr. Martinez says you're measuring perfectly. You're going to be tall like your father." And she still couldn't bring herself to say Callum's name out loud, but she thought about him constantly. Sometimes she would scroll through Mind's End's social media accounts, watching from a distance as his company continued to grow. He'd been featured on the cover of Forbes in month 5 of her pregnancy, looking confident and successful in a charcoal gray suit. The article had mentioned his laser focus and dedication to the company above all else. There was a brief mention of his personal life. Apparently he was dating Vivian Cross, a venture capitalist from Goldman Sachs, the same woman he'd mentioned on that horrible phone call. Carolina had closed her laptop and cried for 20 minutes, grieving not just for what she'd lost, but for what her child would never have. In month 7, her sister Jennifer visited from Ohio, taking one look at Carolina's cramped apartment and immediately going into protective big sister mode. "You can't raise a baby here," Jennifer said bluntly, standing in the middle of the living room that doubled as Carolina's bedroom. At 32, Jennifer was everything Carolina wasn't: married, financially stable, living in a 4-bedroom house in suburban Cleveland with her husband Mark and their 2 kids. "It's not ideal, but it's what I can afford," Carolina replied, defensive despite knowing her sister was right. "Come home with me. Mark and I have been talking about it. You could live with us until you get back on your feet, help with the kids, figure out your next move." The offer was tempting. A real support system, financial security, help with the baby. But it also felt like giving up, like admitting that Callum's dismissal of her had been correct. "I need to try to make it work here first," Carolina said quietly. Jennifer sighed, settling onto the couch beside her sister. "Can I ask you something? Why haven't you told the father? I know you said it's complicated, but Carolina, this is his child too." Carolina was quiet for a long moment, watching the Los Angeles traffic move past her window. "Because he made it very clear that I was nothing to him. And I won't force myself or my baby into someone's life where we're not wanted. But what if he's changed? What if he deserves to know? What if he hasn't?" Carolina countered. "What if he offers me money to go away or tries to take the baby from me, or just ignores us completely? I can't handle any of those scenarios right now." In month 8, Carolina's anxiety reached new heights as her due date approached. She'd taken a childbirth preparation class at the community center, feeling conspicuously alone among the couples practicing breathing techniques and discussing birth plans. Her own plan was simple: get through labor, take care of her baby, and figure out everything else as she went. She'd started experiencing Braxton Hicks contractions, practice contractions that left her breathless and reminded her that she was about to become responsible for another human being's entire existence. The weight of that responsibility felt overwhelming some days, especially when she calculated and recalculated her finances, trying to figure out how to afford childcare so she could work. Late one night in her 9th month, Carolina stood in front of the bathroom mirror examining her reflection. Her body had changed completely. Her breasts were fuller, her face rounder, her hair thicker and shinier than it had ever been. She looked like a mother, she realized. She looked strong. "Almost time to meet you, little one," she whispered, running her hands over her belly. "I know it's just going to be us, but I promise I'll love you enough for 2 parents." The baby kicked in response, a firm jab against her ribs that made her smile despite everything. In 2 weeks she would hold her child for the first time, and maybe eventually, she would find the courage to tell Callum Devereux that his passatempo had created the most important thing in both their lives. The contractions started at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in early May, just as Dr. Martinez had predicted. Carolina woke to a tightening sensation across her belly that was different from the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. This felt purposeful, urgent, like her body had finally decided it was time. She lay in bed for an hour, timing the contractions on her phone app, watching as they gradually became stronger and closer together. When they reached 5 minutes apart, she called the labor and delivery unit at Cedars-Sinai. "This is Carolina Rourke," she said, trying to keep her voice steady as another contraction peaked. "I think I'm in labor." The drive to the hospital was surreal. Los Angeles was still mostly asleep, the freeway surprisingly clear as Carolina navigated her Honda Civic through the early morning darkness. She'd packed her hospital bag weeks ago, a small duffel containing comfortable clothes, toiletries, and a soft blue blanket she'd bought for the baby. At the hospital, she was admitted to a labor and delivery room with pale yellow walls and a large window overlooking the city. Nurse Patricia Williams, a kind woman in her 50s with gentle hands and a warm smile, helped Carolina change into a hospital gown and get settled. "Is your partner on the way?" Patricia asked as she attached monitors to Carolina's belly. "It's just me," Carolina replied, a response she'd practiced but still felt heavy saying out loud. Patricia's expression softened with understanding. "Well, you're in good hands. I've been doing this for 23 years and I'll make sure you have everything you need." Labor progressed slowly. Carolina walked the halls, bounced on an exercise ball, and tried every position the nurses suggested to help the baby descend. By noon, her contractions were intense and regular, but her cervix was dilating slowly. Dr. Martinez arrived during her lunch break, checking Carolina's progress with gentle efficiency. "You're doing beautifully," the doctor assured her. "First babies like to take their time. This little one will come when they're ready." The afternoon hours blurred together in waves of pain and rest. Carolina found herself thinking about Callum during the quiet moments between contractions. She wondered what he was doing right now, probably in a meeting, discussing quarterly projections or product development, completely unaware that his child was about to be born. At 4 p.m., Patricia suggested an epidural as Carolina's pain intensified. The relief was immediate and profound, allowing her to rest and gather strength for what was ahead. "Better?" Patricia asked, adjusting Carolina's pillows. "Much better, thank you." Carolina managed to smile. "Can I ask you something? Do you think I'm crazy for doing this alone?" Patricia sat on the edge of the bed, her expression thoughtful. "Honey, I've seen all kinds of families in this room. Rich ones, poor ones, big ones, small ones. What makes a good parent isn't the number of people in the delivery room. It's the amount of love waiting for that baby, and I can see you've got plenty of that." As evening approached, Carolina finally reached full dilation. The pushing stage began just as the sun was setting over Los Angeles, painting the hospital room in warm golden light. "Okay, Carolina," Dr. Martinez said, taking her position at the foot of the bed. "With the next contraction, I want you to take a deep breath and push like you're having the biggest bowel movement of your life." Despite everything, Carolina laughed. "That's definitely not what I expected you to say." The pushing was harder than anything she'd ever experienced, but there was something primal and empowering about it too. With each contraction, she felt her body working exactly as it was designed to, bringing her baby closer to the world. "I can see the head, Doctor," Martinez announced after 40 minutes of pushing. "Lots of dark hair, just like Mama's." Two more pushes and suddenly there was a rush of relief and sensation unlike anything Carolina had ever felt. A loud, indignant cry filled the room, the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. "It's a boy," Dr. Martinez announced, lifting a small, perfect baby onto Carolina's chest. Carolina looked down at her son and felt her entire world reorganize itself around this tiny, red-faced person. He was beautiful and furious and absolutely perfect. Dark hair covered his small head, and when he briefly opened his eyes, they were the same gray-blue color that all newborns had. But Carolina could already see hints of Callum's steel gray in their depths. "Hello, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm your mama." The baby calmed at the sound of her voice, his tiny fist curling around her finger with surprising strength. Carolina felt tears streaming down her face as she studied every detail of his face. The way his nose was slightly upturned like hers, the strong jawline that was definitely his father's, the long fingers that were already grasping at the world around him. "Have you chosen a name?" Patricia asked softly as she cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket. Carolina had considered dozens of names over the past months, but looking at her son now, only one felt right. "Oliver," she said. "Oliver James Rourke." James had been her father's middle name, and Oliver felt strong and classic, a name that would suit both a child and the man he would become. "Oliver James?" Patricia repeated with a smile. "That's a beautiful name." As the medical team finished their work and the room grew quiet, Carolina held her son against her chest, skin to skin, marveling at how perfectly he fit in her arms. He was 7 pounds, 4 ounces of pure miracle, and he was entirely hers. "Your daddy doesn't know about you yet," she whispered to Oliver as he slept peacefully against her chest. "But someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you about him. I'll tell you that you were made from what I thought was love, and that even though things didn't work out the way I hoped, you are the best thing that ever happened to me." Outside the hospital window, Los Angeles sparkled in the gathering darkness. 8 million people going about their lives, unaware that Carolina Rourke's world had just completely and irrevocably changed for the better. The first 2 months of Oliver's life were a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and moments of pure exhaustion that Carolina had never imagined possible. Her small apartment, which had felt cramped before, now seemed impossibly tiny, with a crib squeezed into the corner of her bedroom and baby supplies covering every available surface. Oliver was a good baby, but he was still a baby. He woke every 2 hours for feedings, and Carolina's attempts at breastfeeding had been complicated by low milk supply, a common issue that Dr. Martinez assured her wasn't her fault, but still left Carolina feeling inadequate as a mother. "It's okay, sweet boy," she whispered to Oliver at 3 a.m. on a particularly difficult night, mixing formula with shaking hands while he cried in his bouncy seat. "Mama's doing her best." The formula was expensive, nearly $30 for a container that lasted less than a week, and Carolina found herself making increasingly difficult choices between groceries and baby supplies. She'd taken on small graphic design projects that she could complete during Oliver's naps, but the work was inconsistent, and the pay barely covered their basic needs. Her sister Jennifer called twice a week, offering again and again to help financially or to have Carolina come stay with her family in Ohio. "I'm worried about you," Jennifer said during one of their evening phone calls. Carolina was pacing her small living room, bouncing Oliver gently as he fussed. "You sound exhausted, and you can't keep living on 3 hours of sleep a night." "New mothers are supposed to be tired," Carolina replied, though she knew she looked terrible. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror showed dark circles under her eyes, pale skin, and hair that hadn't been properly washed in days. "This is different, and you know it. You're doing this completely alone. At least let me send you some money for groceries." Carolina's pride warred with her practical need. She'd been surviving on peanut butter sandwiches and instant ramen, while making sure Oliver had everything he needed. "Maybe just this once," she admitted quietly. The money Jennifer sent helped, but it came with a renewed push for Carolina to move to Ohio. It was tempting, the promise of help with Oliver, a support system, the chance to save money while she figured out her next steps, but it also felt like giving up on the life she'd tried to build in Los Angeles. More importantly, it felt like admitting that Callum had been right to dismiss her. Carolina had developed a routine of checking Mindzen's social media accounts, a masochistic habit she couldn't seem to break. Callum appeared regularly in posts about company milestones, industry conferences, and partnership announcements. In one photo from a tech summit in San Francisco, he stood next to Vivian Cross, both of them smiling professionally for the camera. The caption mentioned their recent engagement. Engaged. Callum was engaged to the venture capitalist he'd mentioned in that phone call, the woman who was more appropriate for someone in his position. Carolina stared at the photo for a long time, studying Callum's face for any sign of the man who had once whispered about being terrified of losing her. Vivian was beautiful in a polished, sophisticated way. Blonde hair in a perfect bob, designer suit, the kind of confident smile that suggested she'd never doubted her place in the world. She closed the laptop and looked at Oliver, who was sleeping peacefully in his swing. At 8 weeks old, he was starting to look more like a person and less like a tiny alien. His dark hair had grown thicker, and when he was awake, his eyes were definitely turning gray like his father's. He had Callum's long fingers and strong jawline, but Carolina's nose and the way his mouth curved when he smiled. "Your daddy's getting married," she told the sleeping baby, "to someone who probably never has to choose between buying diapers and paying the electric bill." That evening, as Carolina struggled to keep her eyes open while Oliver had his last feeding of the day, she made a decision that had been building for weeks. She was going to tell Callum about Oliver, not because she wanted anything from him, not money, not a relationship, not even acknowledgement, but because Oliver deserved to know who his father was, and Callum deserved to know he had a son, even if he chose to do nothing with that information. Carolina had been carrying this secret for 11 months, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. Every time she looked at Oliver's gray eyes or watched him grab at objects with those long, elegant fingers, she was reminded that half of his genetic makeup came from a man who didn't even know he existed. She thought about the timing. Callum's engagement announcement had been posted just 2 days ago, which meant he was probably in a good place in his life, successful, happy, planning a future with someone he'd chosen this time. Maybe that would make him more receptive to the news, or maybe it would make him want to protect his new life from complications. Either way, Carolina realized she couldn't keep carrying this alone. The next morning, she spent Oliver's morning nap researching MindZen's upcoming events. There had to be a public appearance where she could approach Callum directly, somewhere she could control the narrative instead of risking a phone call or email that might be ignored or filtered through assistants. She found what she was looking for. MindZen's 10th anniversary celebration was scheduled for the following week at a rooftop venue in Beverly Hills. The event was being live-streamed and covered by tech media, which meant Callum would be there, probably giving speeches and accepting congratulations. It was perfect and terrifying in equal measure. Carolina looked at Oliver, who was starting to stir in his crib, making the soft sounds that meant he was waking up hungry. "What do you think, baby boy?" she asked, lifting him into her arms. "Should Mama go tell your daddy about you?" Oliver looked at her with those serious gray eyes that reminded her so much of Callum, and for a moment, Carolina could have sworn she saw understanding in his gaze. She had a week to prepare, a week to find the courage to walk into that room and change everything. Carolina stood outside the Beverly Hills Meridian Tower, holding Oliver against her chest, watching elegantly dressed guests stream into the building through glass doors that reflected the early evening sky. She'd spent the last week preparing for this moment, but now that she was here, her resolve was wavering. She'd borrowed a simple black dress from her neighbor, Elena, a single mother of 2 who understood what it meant to make something work with limited resources. The dress was classic and dignified, appropriate for the occasion without drawing unnecessary attention. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, and she'd applied just enough makeup to hide the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. Oliver was dressed in the one nice outfit she owned for him, a soft blue romper that brought out his gray eyes. At 2 months old, he was alert and curious, his gaze taking in the lights and movement around them with serious attention. "We can still go home," Carolina whispered to him, her voice barely audible over the sound of traffic on Wilshire Boulevard. "We don't have to do this." But even as she said the words, she knew she couldn't turn back. This moment had been building for 11 months through pregnancy, labor, sleepless nights, and the growing weight of a secret that was too big for one person to carry. Carolina took a deep breath and walked toward the building entrance. The lobby was all marble and crystal, designed to impress. A registration table was set up near the elevators, staffed by young professionals with tablets and bright smiles. Carolina recognized the MindZen branding immediately, the clean, minimalist aesthetic that had once felt like home. "Good evening," said a cheerful woman with a headset and a tablet. "Are you here for the MindZen anniversary celebration?" "Yes," Carolina replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Name for the guest list?" Carolina's heart pounded. She obviously wasn't on any guest list. I'm a former employee. I wanted to congratulate Mr. Devereaux personally. The woman's smile flickered slightly as she scanned her tablet. I don't see your name here. Let me check with my supervisor. That's okay, Carolina said quickly. I'll just wait in the lobby. Could you let him know that Carolina Rourke is here to see him? I'm sorry, but without being on the guest list, I can't. Please. Carolina's voice carried a note of desperation that made the woman pause. Just tell him Carolina is here. He'll understand. Oliver made a soft sound, drawing the woman's attention. Her expression softened as she looked at the baby. Let me see what I can do, she said quietly, stepping away to speak into her headset. Carolina waited, swaying gently to keep Oliver calm as guests continued to flow past them toward the elevators. She recognized some faces, former colleagues, tech industry executives, investors she'd seen at company events when she'd been part of this world. After what felt like an eternity, the woman returned. I spoke to Mr. Devereaux's assistant. He's in the middle of interviews with tech media, but she said if you'd like to wait, there might be an opportunity later in the evening. It wasn't the direct access Carolina had hoped for, but it was something. Thank you, I'll wait. She found a seat in the lobby's seating area, positioning herself where she could see the elevator bank. From here, she could also see the live stream of the event playing on mounted screens throughout the lobby. Callum appeared on camera, looking exactly as she remembered. Confident, articulate, commanding attention effortlessly. He was being interviewed by a tech journalist, discussing MindZen's evolution over the past decade. Carolina found herself studying his face, looking for changes. He seemed thinner, perhaps, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of restless energy that suggested success hadn't brought him the peace he'd been seeking. The key to MindZen's success, Callum was saying on the screen, has always been our focus on authentic human connection. Technology should enhance our ability to connect with what matters most, not distract us from it. The irony wasn't lost on Carolina. Here was a man talking about authentic connection, while she sat 40 floors below him, holding his son, unable to tell him the most important truth of their lives. Oliver began to fuss, and Carolina realized he was probably hungry. She'd brought bottles of formula, but feeding him here in the lobby felt too exposed, too vulnerable. She found a quiet corner near the restrooms where she could sit and give Oliver his bottle in relative privacy. As she fed him, Carolina watched the elevator numbers climb up and down, carrying guests to and from the celebration above. She thought about all the times she'd ridden those same elevators to Callum's office, full of excitement about a new project or nervous anticipation about a late dinner that might turn into something more. Your daddy's up there right now, she murmured to Oliver, who was drinking contentedly. He's probably giving speeches and accepting congratulations, surrounded by people who think he has everything figured out. Oliver's gray eyes looked up at her as if he understood every word. At 9 p.m., the lobby began to fill with guests leaving the event. Carolina's heart rate increased as she recognized more faces, knowing that Callum might appear at any moment. She stood up, adjusting Oliver in her arms, preparing herself for a confrontation that could change everything. That's when she saw him. Callum stepped out of the elevator, surrounded by a small group of executives and investors. He was laughing at something someone had said, his hand resting casually on the lower back of a blonde woman in an elegant navy dress. Vivian Cross, his fiancée. Carolina's breath caught. Seeing them together in person was different from looking at photos online. They looked like they belonged together, polished and successful, the kind of power couple that graced magazine covers. For a moment, Carolina considered retreating, slipping out of the building before anyone noticed her. This was Callum's moment of triumph, surrounded by his chosen people, planning a future with a woman who fit perfectly into his world. But then Oliver made a soft cooing sound, and Carolina looked down at his perfect face. Callum's eyes, her nose, a combination of both their stubborn chins, and she knew she couldn't leave. She stepped forward, moving through the crowd with quiet determination. Several people glanced at her curiously, probably wondering who she was and why she had a baby at a corporate event. But Carolina kept her focus on Callum. When she was about 10 feet away, their eyes met. The effect was immediate and electric. Callum stopped mid-sentence, his face going pale, his confident smile vanishing as if someone had flipped a switch. The group around him continued talking for a moment, before noticing that he was no longer participating in the conversation. Callum? Vivian touched his arm gently. Are you all right? But Callum wasn't looking at his fiancée. He was staring at Carolina with an expression of complete shock, his gaze moving from her face to the baby in her arms and back again. The lobby seemed to quiet around them, though Carolina knew that was probably just her imagination. Time felt suspended as she stood there holding Oliver, waiting for Callum to say something, to do something, to acknowledge that his entire world had just shifted. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but she heard every word clearly. Carolina. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with 11 months of unspoken words and unshared pain. Callum's face had gone from confident CEO to vulnerable human being in the span of seconds, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Oliver with an intensity that made Carolina's heart race. Vivian followed Callum's gaze, her perfectly manicured hand still resting on his arm. "Callum, who is this?" Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having questions answered immediately. But Callum seemed incapable of speech. He took a step toward Carolina, then stopped, as if an invisible barrier prevented him from getting closer. The group of executives around them had noticed the tension, their conversation dying as they watched their celebrated CEO stare at a young woman holding a baby. "We need to talk," Carolina said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush of the lobby. "Privately, Callum's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Yes, we should. There's a conference room on the 3rd floor. Vivian's grip on his arm tightened. "Callum, we have the after-party at the Peninsula. The Goldman Sachs partners are expecting us." For the first time since Carolina had known him, Callum seemed to not care about a business obligation. "Cancel it," he said without looking at his fiancée. "Or go without me. I need to handle this." "Handle what exactly?" Vivian's tone had shifted from confusion to something sharper. She was a smart woman, Carolina realized, and she was beginning to piece together what she was seeing. Callum finally looked at Vivian, and Carolina saw something in his expression that might have been regret or guilt, or simply the weight of a life-changing moment. "I'll explain everything later, I promise. But right now, I need to speak with Carolina." The ride up to the 3rd floor was the longest elevator trip of Carolina's life. She stood on one side with Oliver, who was sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding him. Callum stood on the opposite side, his hands clenched at his sides, stealing glances at the baby every few seconds as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The conference room was sterile and professional, glass walls, a long table, motivational posters about innovation and teamwork. Callum closed the door and activated the privacy glass, turning the transparent walls opaque with the touch of a button. They stood facing each other across the polished table, Carolina still holding Oliver protectively against her chest. "Is he?" Callum's voice was hoarse. "Is he mine?" Carolina had imagined this moment countless times, but she'd never expected Callum to look so broken, so utterly undone. "His name is Oliver," she said softly. "Oliver James Rourke, and yes, he's yours." Callum sank into one of the leather chairs as if his legs could no longer support him. He buried his face in his hands for a moment before looking up at Carolina with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. 11 months, he whispered. "You've been carrying this alone for 11 months. I tried to tell you," Carolina said, her own voice breaking slightly. "That night when you fired me, I came back to your office. I was going to tell you I thought I might be pregnant." Callum's face went even paler. "But you left without saying anything." "Because I heard you on the phone with Daniel." The words came out in a rush. 11 months of pain and anger finally finding their voice. "I heard you call me a passatempo, a distraction. You said I was just something convenient while it lasted, that women like me start imagining futures that were never on the table." The impact of her words was visible on Callum's face. He looked like she'd physically struck him. "Oh God, Carolina. Oh God, no. You said you needed to get your head clear, that I was becoming a distraction you couldn't afford." Carolina's voice was steady now, strengthened by the truth she'd been carrying. "So I left. And I raised your son alone while you moved on with your life and got engaged to someone more appropriate for your position." Callum stood abruptly, running his hands through his hair in a gesture she remembered from their time together. "You don't understand. That conversation with Daniel, I was trying to convince myself that what I felt for you wasn't real. I was terrified, Carolina, terrified of how much you meant to me. So you fired me? So I made the biggest mistake of my life." His voice cracked with emotion. "I told myself I was protecting the company, protecting my reputation. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. Because for the first time in my adult life, someone mattered more to me than Mind's in. and it scared the hell out of me. Oliver stirred in Carolina's arms, making soft baby sounds that drew both their attention. Callum's expression softened as he looked at his son, wonder replacing the anguish in his eyes. Can I hold him?" he asked hesitantly. Carolina hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached Callum. "Support his head," she instructed softly, as she carefully transferred Oliver into his father's arms. The moment Callum held his son for the first time was transformational. His large hands cradled the tiny baby with surprising gentleness, and when Oliver opened his gray eyes and looked up at his father, Callum made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He has my eyes," Callum whispered in amazement. "And your stubborn chin," Carolina added, "despite everything. And your beautiful nose." Callum looked up at her, tears streaming down his face without shame. "He's perfect, Carolina. He's absolutely perfect." They stood there in silence for several minutes, both of them watching Oliver, who seemed content in his father's arms. Finally, Callum spoke again, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I have no right to ask this, but I need you to know something. Every day for the past 11 months I've regretted letting you go. I threw myself into work, into this relationship with Vivian, into anything that would stop me from thinking about you. But nothing worked. You've been in my thoughts every single day." Carolina felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "Callum, I'm not asking you to forgive me," he continued quickly. "I'm not asking for anything except the chance to be Oliver's father, to support both of you, to make up for the time I've lost, to prove that I can be better than the man who hurt you. What about Vivian? What about your engagement?" Callum's jaw tightened with determination. "Vivian deserves someone who can love her completely without reservation, and I can't do that. I've been trying to convince myself that I could, but seeing you tonight, holding our son," he shook his head. "I can't marry her, Carolina. It wouldn't be fair to any of us." Oliver began to fuss, and Carolina instinctively reached for him. As Callum carefully transferred the baby back to her arms, their hands brushed, sending a familiar electric current through both of them. "I don't know if I can trust you again," Carolina said honestly. "You shattered me, Callum. You made me feel like I was nothing." "You were everything," he replied fiercely. "You were everything, and I was too much of a coward to admit it. But I'm not that man anymore, Carolina. Becoming successful, achieving everything I thought I wanted. It all felt empty without you." Carolina looked down at Oliver, who was gazing up at her with those serious gray eyes that belonged to both his parents. "He deserves to know his father," she said quietly, "but I won't let you hurt him the way you hurt me. I swear to you on my life that I will never hurt either of you again. Give me a chance to prove it. Give me a chance to be the man you both deserve." Outside the conference room windows, Los Angeles stretched endlessly in all directions. 8 million people living their lives, making their choices, taking their chances on love and hope and second beginnings. Carolina looked at Callum, really looked at him, and saw not the polished CEO who had dismissed her as a distraction, but the man who had whispered his fears in the darkness, who had held her like she was precious, who was now holding their son like he was the most important thing in the world. "This doesn't fix everything," she said finally. "Trust isn't rebuilt overnight." "I know," Callum replied, his voice steady with newfound resolve. "But I have the rest of my life to earn it back, if you'll let me try." 8 months later, the sound of Oliver's laughter filled the sunny kitchen of Carolina's new apartment in Santa Monica, just 3 blocks from the beach. At 10 months old, he was sitting in his high chair, gleefully smashing pieces of banana between his tiny fingers while his father attempted to feed him actual spoonfuls of baby food. "I think more food is ending up on you than in him," Carolina observed, trying not to smile as she watched Callum's expensive white button-down shirt acquire several new stains. "Strategic misdirection," Callum replied solemnly, wiping pureed sweet potato from his cheek. "He's testing my commitment to this whole parenting thing. And how are you scoring so far?" Callum looked down at his ruined shirt, then at Oliver, who was beaming at him with those familiar gray eyes. "I think I'm winning." The past 8 months had been a careful dance of rebuilding trust and learning to be a family. True to his word, Callum had ended his engagement to Vivian the day after the anniversary event, a conversation that had been painful but necessary. Vivian had been hurt and angry, but ultimately she'd understood that she deserved someone who could love her without reservation. Callum had also taken a step back from the day-to-day operations of Mindzen, appointing Daniel as CEO while he transitioned to a chairman role. It was a decision that had shocked the tech industry, but Callum had been clear about his priorities. He wanted to be present for his son in a way his own father never had been. The transition hadn't been smooth. Carolina had been cautious, protective, setting clear boundaries about Callum's involvement in Oliver's life. They'd started with supervised visits, then gradually increased his time with Oliver as trust slowly rebuilt between them. Callum had insisted on providing financial support immediately, paying off Carolina's medical bills from Oliver's birth and setting up a generous monthly allowance that allowed her to focus on freelance work she actually enjoyed, rather than scrambling for any project that paid. He'd also helped her find this apartment, spacious, safe, with a nursery that got perfect morning light and a kitchen large enough for family meals. "Da-da!" Oliver suddenly exclaimed, clapping his banana-covered hands together. It was one of his first words, along with mama and more, and it never failed to make Callum's face light up with pure joy. "That's right, buddy," Callum said softly, leaning over to kiss the top of Oliver's dark hair. "Dada's here." Carolina watched the interaction with a mixture of warmth and lingering caution. Callum had been nothing but reliable and devoted for 8 months, but part of her still waited for him to realize that this life, messy mornings and sleepless nights, and the endless demands of loving a child, wasn't as appealing as the polished perfection of his former existence. "I have something to tell you," Callum said, straightening up and reaching for a towel to clean Oliver's hands and face. Carolina's stomach tightened slightly. Over the months, she'd learned to read Callum's expressions, and this one suggested important news. "I've been offered a position," he continued, Chief Innovation Officer at a nonprofit called Tech Forward. They develop educational technology for underserved communities. "That's—" Carolina paused, processing the information. "That's very different from mine, Zen. Completely different. Lower salary, longer hours, less prestige. But the work matters, Carolina. Really matters. And it would mean I could stay in Los Angeles, be close to Oliver, be close to—" He gestured between them, leaving the sentence unfinished. They still hadn't defined what they were to each other. Co-parents, certainly. Friends, perhaps. But the undercurrent of something deeper ran between them constantly, unspoken, but undeniable. "What about your stake in mine, Zen?" Carolina asked. "I'll keep my equity position, but I'm ready to do something meaningful with my career instead of just profitable." Callum lifted Oliver from his high chair, settling him on his hip with practiced ease. "I want our son to grow up knowing his father builds things that help people, not just things that make money. Our son." The phrase still made Carolina's heart flutter, even after 8 months of hearing it. Oliver reached for his toy giraffe, which had fallen to the floor, and Callum bent to retrieve it, making exaggerated animal sounds that sent Oliver into giggles. Watching them together, Carolina felt the last of her defensive walls beginning to crumble. "There's something else," Callum said, his voice suddenly nervous. "I've been going to therapy, individual sessions with Dr. Amanda Foster. She specializes in attachment issues and fear of intimacy." Carolina looked at him in surprise. "Callum, I need to understand why I sabotaged the best thing that ever happened to me," he said simply. "I need to make sure I never do it again. To you, to Oliver, to anyone I love." The word love hung in the air between them, and Carolina felt her breath catch. "I'm not asking for anything," Callum continued quickly. "I'm not asking you to trust me completely, or to promise me anything. I just want you to know that I'm doing the work to become the man you both deserve." Oliver had grown drowsy in his father's arms, his small head resting against Callum's shoulder. The sight of her son so comfortable and secure with his father did something to Carolina's heart that she wasn't quite ready to examine. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about maybe getting a place with a proper guest room, so Oliver could have overnight visits with his father without having to go to a hotel." It was a small step, but Callum's face lit up as if she'd offered him the world. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I'd like that very much." As the afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, painting everything golden, Carolina allowed herself to imagine a different future than the one she'd been carefully guarding against. Maybe it was possible to build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Maybe trust could be earned back, one honest conversation and reliable action at a time. Maybe love, real, tested, mature love, was worth the risk of hoping again. "Oliver's getting sleepy," she observed, noticing her son's heavy eyelids. "I'll put him down for his nap," Callum offered, already moving toward the nursery. "Then maybe we could talk. About the job, about the guest room, About whatever you're comfortable discussing. Carolina nodded, watching as Callum carried their son down the hallway, humming softly. Through the nursery's open door, she could hear him reading Oliver's favorite book about a little bear who goes on adventures but always comes home to his family. As she cleaned up the remnants of lunch, Carolina caught her reflection in the window and was surprised to see herself smiling. For the first time in almost 2 years, the future felt full of possibilities instead of just challenges to survive. When Callum returned from the nursery, they sat together on the couch where Oliver had been conceived in what felt like another lifetime. The afternoon light was softer now, and the apartment was quiet, except for the distant sound of waves from the nearby beach. "Thank you," Callum said suddenly. "For what?" "For giving me this chance. For letting me into Oliver's life. For believing that people can change." He paused, looking at her with those gray eyes that their son had inherited. "For being strong enough to raise our child alone when I wasn't brave enough to stay." Carolina felt tears prick her eyes. "You're here now. I'm here now," he agreed. "And I'm not going anywhere." Outside, Los Angeles continued its eternal dance of dreams and second chances, of people brave enough to rebuild their lives from broken pieces. And in a sunny apartment 3 blocks from the ocean, 2 people who had found and found each other again, began the careful work of building something that could last. What would you have done in Carolina's position? Would you have given him a second chance, or would protecting your heart have been more important? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.